Hello and welcome to another off-the-shelf board game review. This week we're going to be looking at Dungeon Lords. Dungeon Lords is a strategy game for 2 to 4 players, designed by Untitled. It's published by Chex Games Edition, but also in the United States it's released and published by Z-Man Games. It also happens to have some very fantastic art involved and included in the game that's very thematic and looks extremely awesome. So I want to give an extra mention for the artist, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name right, but it's David Cochard. In Dungeon Lords, players are competing to become the most powerful and the most well-known dungeon keeper in all the land. And I'm just going to go ahead and say it right here. If you're a fan of PC games in the 80s and you ever played Dungeon Keeper, you're going to fit right in and really enjoy the theme of Dungeon Lords. In Dungeon Lords, players are going to be working to try to create the best, most powerful dungeon that unfortunately would-be heroes want nothing better than to lay waste to, because that's basically what heroes do. They seem to think that anybody who creates a big, powerful dungeon just happens to have a lot of treasure, and they're going to do everything they can to destroy your hard work. Luckily, you're not going to have to do this alone, because you're going to have creatures to rely on to help you protect your dungeon and keep these do-gooders away. You'll have trolls, you have goblins, witches, ghosts, slimes, vampires, and tons of creatures at your disposal to help you take care of these do-gooders who want to ruin your day. Of course, you have to be very careful though, because for some reason, hiring vampires, hiring witches, hiring trolls and goblins and everything like that to populate your dungeons has a tendency to attract paladins who are even more do-gooders than these adventurers, and they want nothing more to take you down a peg, 2 or 3. The players are going to have to work competitively through 4 seasons from winter, spring, summer, and fall, working competitively to try to gather as many resources as they can to feed their minions inside their dungeons and collect gold to pay their taxes, because unfortunately the Ministry of Dungeons wants nothing more to profit, and they're going to profit based on just how big your dungeon is. Can you pay your taxes? Keep your monsters fed? Keep your level of evil just in check, because if you don't, paladins love nothing more than to go after the dungeon lord who happens to have the most evil, the worst reputation, is just a little bit the nastiest person, all while directing your minions and having your imps go to work for you inside your dungeons. That is Dungeon Lords, the board game. Before I begin this tutorial video, I just want to preface it by letting you know I'm going to be teaching you how to play Dungeon Lords with the standard rules only. I'm not going to include any of the advanced rules, and there's a pretty good reason for that. But it does basically mean that I will not be using any of the random special event cards for this tutorial. It also means that the item tokens won't be included in this tutorial. Now, both those items can be discovered pretty easily. The item rules are actually downloadable from Chex Games Edition's website. And the event cards, they really are not that hard to learn. They're just going to add a little bit more of a randomizer to a game that's already a game about controlled chaos. Now, the main reason why I'm doing that is because this game is already a challenge to learn to play well, and adding more will only confuse and overwhelm brand new players of the game. It really is enough to drive anyone completely insane if you want to learn this game with all the rules fully included if you're a brand new player. Dungeon Lords is a game about learning how to control chaos efficiently, and that's just something you're not going to be able to do as a new player, and adding on more rules, more randomizers, and more special events is just going to make it even more challenging, and eventually it's just going to frustrate new players to this awesome board game. Dungeon Lords is also one of those games that is really about prowess. This is one of those games where a very advanced player will absolutely trounce and decimate a brand new player, especially if you start piling on all these extra rules, because players are going to be overwhelmed. Players are going to become lost because they're going to have so many options, and they're basically going to be sunk in this quagmire of all these options, feel like they're overwhelmed, and they're just not going to win, which is going to be even more of a downer when they get completely slaughtered at the end of the game by 20 or more points. My point here is that if you're teaching Dungeon Lords to new players, use the standard rules. Don't throw in any of the advanced rules. It's just going to make things more difficult and probably ruin the enjoyment of this really fantastic, awesome game designed by Untitled. Dungeon Lords is played over 2 full game years, and it's broken down into 4 seasons. You're going to be playing from winter through spring, through summer, all the way through fall. At the end of every single year, and again the game is played for 2 years, there's going to be a combat phase where all these adventurers who have been piling up on the seasons board are going to be inside each player's dungeon that are going to be doing their darndest to ruin all your hard work and destroy your dungeon, because that's what adventurers do. And even if you're just an honest dungeon keeper trying to make an honest day's wages by raising vampires, witches, creatures of the night, you know, typical dungeon keeper type stuff, adventurers will be adventurers, and they're going to do what adventurers do best. So basically, in Dungeon Lords, you're going to be doing your darndest to build up your dungeon by building tunnels, by building traps, by hiring monsters to help protect your dungeon, all the way in an effort to survive through 2 years without your dungeon getting totally trashed. Every time one of the adventurers conquer one of your rooms, it's going to be worth negative victory points at the end of the game for you. But for every dungeon that you happen to have still intact, for every room that you still happen to have intact, for all the monsters you have possibly that you still have in your dungeon, these are going to give you victory points at the end of the game. You're also going to gain victory points for any adventurers that you happen to lock up in your dungeon, purely for innocent reasons. It was truly to protect your best interests. You're also going to get victory points at the end of the game for earning titles, such as the best dungeon lord, the most misunderstood dungeon lord, and also for having the best dungeon overall at the end of the game. The game can be very brutal and very challenging for you the first time you play, so if you end the game with at least 1 victory point and not in the negatives, it's worth being happy and celebrating over. Now, as I said, the game is played out over 2 years, and that does mean that it's going to start off a little bit easy and a little bit gentler on you in the beginning, and the game's going to get much more challenging as the game goes on. And the way you differentiate that is you'll see that all these cards, they have a gold back and they also have a silver back. All the cards that have a silver back are going to be involved in the first year. All the cards that have a gold back are going to be involved in the second year. Basically what you're going to do is you're going to make sure you shuffle up all these tokens. You have your monster tokens, you have your hero tokens, and you have your paladin tokens. They're all going to be laid out, and they're going to be put down in a way to make sure that you're encountering all the silver cards before you encounter all the gold ones. And it's perfectly measured out, so you're going to go through all the silver ones. First year is going to end, second year is going to start, and you're going to have access to all the gold-backed rooms, gold-backed monsters, and gold-backed adventurers who are doing nothing more than destroying your fun. This also happens to go for the combat cards that come with the game. The game comes with 9 combat cards, 9 with a silver back or a silver single sword if you forget. There's also 9 combat cards with a gold double sword back. You're basically only going to be using 4 of these for every single game you play, so you're going to shuffle these up. Grab 4 at random, make sure you don't examine them, and you're going to place the ones with the gold back on the second year board. The other 5 are going to be removed from the game, and you're going to do the same with the silver back cards. You're going to shuffle them up, take 4 of them, and they're going to start on the board right here. And these are going to be the combat cards, the players are going to experience the first year. These are the combat cards the players are going to experience the second year. The extra 5 are removed from the game, not to be added ever into the game, and that's going to be one of the randomizers built into the game that makes the gameplay ever so slightly different. And I shouldn't say ever so slightly, because like I said earlier, this is a game about controlled chaos. This game plays a lot different every single time you play it. You're also going to set up the Distant Lands board, or sometimes I refer to it as a second year board, but it's a Distant Lands board, which is going to be interacted with throughout the game, and it's where all the extra pieces are going to come from. But the first thing you do is you need to make sure you put the gold monsters down on the bottom, silver monsters on top, so you only encounter the silver monsters for the first year. For the rooms, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to put the gold rooms down on the bottom, so you don't get any of the gold rooms the first year. Silver rooms are going to go on top, so you get the silver rooms throughout the first year. Gold adventurers get their own little stack. Silver adventurers get their own stack. The reason why you don't stack them on top of each other is because the stack's going to be too high and it's going to fall over, and luckily they're nice enough to give you 2 spaces for it. Also, your randomizer event tokens are going to be placed here. These are also going to be randomized and shuffled, so you don't know exactly which order they're going to come out. And then once you've shuffled them up, you're going to place them on the season board in the 3 spaces form, and you see where those spaces are because they're squares, so they're pretty easy to tell apart. Not too hard there. The central board is going to be set up with all the food the players can earn. The combat cards, again, players are not allowed to look at these unless they take a special action. The corridors that they're going to be adding to their dungeon, the gold, the paladins. Remember, the silver paladin goes on top. You will not encounter the gold paladin until the second year. Every player is going to keep their evil tracker on the evil track, and every player is going to start on this very light shaded section. You're just going to simply put your cube on the light shaded section. Lower towards the good is better, well, or maybe not, depending on your strategy. Up higher is more evil or more darker and more potential to attract the paladin who's going to come out there and ruin your day. The deck of trap cards is going to be shuffled up, placed right here for players to purchase when they take certain actions, and all the imps that are available for hire are going to be placed here on the central board. Each player is also going to get a board in whatever color they like. They're going to get their stack of personal cards in their matching color. They're also going to get 3 minions, and they're going to get some starting resources. The starting resources, if you ever forget, you're going to get 3 of every single starting resource. And if you forget, you just basically remember that you get 3 minions who are going to go out there and do your bidding on the central board. So you're also going to get 3 imps who are going to go in your imp storage. You're going to get 3 gold. You're going to start off with 3 food. And you're also going to start off with 3 tunnel tiles. It's pretty easy to remember in case you ever forget. It's simply 3, 3, 3, and 3. And again, if you ever forget, it's also the amount of minions that you start with. And everybody starts with the same amount of minions, same amount of gold, same amount of food, same amount of imps, and the same 3 tiles, or corridor tiles. And they're going to be laid out in your starting dungeon formation. Everybody starts their board with their 3 tunnels set up the exact same way. The best way to think about Dungeon Lords is that this is actually 2 games melded into 1 game overall. And the reason why I say that and the way this will make more sense to you to describe it this way is because basically when you're playing Dungeon Lords, the first half of the year is basically you're going to be going through the seasons, and your main objective by going through all these seasons is to be gathering all the resources you're going to need. And by those resources, I mean building up your dungeon, hiring your monsters that are going to protect your dungeon, and getting traps to help defeat the adventures that are going to be coming, and to get gold to pay your taxes, because you are going to be charged taxes every single year randomly by one of these squares being flipped over. Every player is going to have to pay taxes based on just how big their dungeon is. And you also need to gather food, because food is needed to feed a lot of your monsters. You're going to need to feed your monsters the moment you hire them, and once every year, one of these blue tokens is going to be flipped over, and it's going to represent the time when you're going to have to feed all your monsters. If you can't feed your monsters, you're going to lose them. They're going to go rampaging across the land, and they're going to name drop you just a couple times. Every time they name drop you, your evil level is just going to go up 1 more point, because they're going to make sure all the citizens know that they're rampaging just because you didn't feed them. Generally, as the seasons slowly pass, as you're going from winter to spring to summer to fall, adventurers are slowly going to start filling up on this board. And the adventurers are going to go after the dungeon master or the dungeon keeper, who happens to be the most evil, the most darkest, or just happens to be the most... who am I kidding here? Adventurers love nothing better than to brag about taking out the biggest, toughest dungeon lord. And if you're the biggest, baddest dungeon lord, the biggest, baddest adventurers are going to go after you. And that's represented by the evil track. The further up you are on the evil track, the more powerful the adventurers are you're going to be attracting across as the seasons slowly keep spreading from winter all the way to fall. While the meeker dungeon lord, the dungeon lord who has the better PR campaign, the dungeon lord who lets everybody know that, hey, he's there to be everybody's single friend, is going to attract the weaker adventurers to their dungeon, because there's not much honor, there's not much glory, and let's face it, there's no good tales around the barroom table when you went after the weakest dungeon keeper. So as I said, the first half of the game of each year is broken down by you gathering as many resources as you can, because at the end of every single year, you're going to have a group of adventurers waiting at the door to your dungeon who are going to go in there and they're going to terrorize your dungeon. And that's when the second half of the game begins, or the combat phase. During the combat phase, the adventurers are slowly going to work into your dungeon, and if they're working through your corridors, you're going to be able to choose 1 monster and 1 trap if you happen to have them, because remember, you're spending the prior part of the game trying to gather those resources, trying to gather those traps, trying to gather those monsters, and feed those monsters. So now you got to go ahead and protect your dungeon during the combat phase. During the combat phase, you're going to take any monsters that you happen to have gathered up through the year, and you're going to be able to put 1 monster and 1 trap if you happen to grab the right resources, and they're going to go ahead and try to protect this 1 first corridor room, so these adventurers don't make your life miserable and don't ruin your pristine, nice, wonderful, dark den of darkness. If your master plan of your monster and your trap manages to defeat all 3 of the adventurers, then these adventurers get to spend the rest of their lives in your dungeon, your dark club bed for unwelcome adventurers. If your monsters and your trap fails to protect your room, though, unfortunately that does mean that the adventurers are going to successfully conquer that corridor or conquer that room, and you're not going to get any victory points. And as a matter of fact, you're actually going to lose victory points out of the game for having rooms conquered. The adventurer is then going to move on to the next level of your dungeon, where they're going to attempt to do the same thing. You're going to have to do this 4 times, either 4 times where they're going to completely keep decimating every single level of your dungeon, or you're going to try to defeat all 3 of these adventurers before they decimate all 4 layers. If they manage to get through 4 layers of your dungeon, that's going to end the combat phase for the game and you get a slight reprieve. Unless, of course, they happen to defeat all the layers of your dungeon, then after that they're going to start freeing any captured adventurers that happen to be in your dungeon. And yes, that does mean you're losing more victory points because you're only going to get victory points in the game for adventurers that are still in your dungeon at the end of the 2nd year. You also have to be very careful for the simple fact that while a paladin can accept a little bit of evil in the world, they can't accept too much evil in the world, and any dungeon keeper who happens to reach the level where the paladin is going to go out and attack dungeons is going to earn the ire of this holy warrior who's also going to help these adventurers come after your dungeon, making your life even more difficult. The advantage of this, though, is if you happen to defeat the paladin, he's worth even more points than a standard adventurer at the end of the game. The negative to this, though, is that the paladin is a very powerful warrior, and he's basically a party unto himself. The combat phase is going to come to an end in one of 3 ways. Either you're going to defeat all the adventurers before 4 combat rounds comes to an end, and you're going to be happy because your dungeon's not going to get trashed, or all these adventurers are going to manage to defeat 4 of your corridors or rooms, or a combination of both, and they're going to get bored of your dungeon and realize that you're just not as terrible as you thought you were, and they're going to move on to greener pastures. Or if you happen to have no unconquered tiles left on the board, or on your personal dungeon board left anymore, then the heroes are going to slowly start freeing any of their captive friends, one by one, every time they're supposed to take over a tile and there's none to take over. That's going to allow them to free 1 prisoner from your dungeon. After the combat is finished for all the players, you're simply going to do the exact same thing again for the 2nd year, except now you're going to be using the gold heroes, the gold monsters, the gold rooms, the gold combat cards, and the ante is going to be raised because your monsters you have access to and the adventurers that are going to come attack your dungeons are all going to become much more powerful. You're simply going to go through all 4 of the seasons again, try to get as many resources as you can while you wait for the adventurers to come at you at the end of the year. Go through the 2nd combat phase, survive as best as you can. That ends the game. You add up all the scores for all the players. Whoever has the most victory points is the winner. And now that you have the basic overview of exactly how Dungeon Lords is going to play, I can show you exactly how the game plays throughout the rounds and the phases. Now, like I said, Dungeon Lords is basically 2 very distinct halves of a game broken down, and that goes to make your 1st and your 2nd year. You have your 1st half where you're just gathering all the resources. Then you have your 2nd half where you're going into combat and protecting your dungeon. Believe it or not, when you're explaining Dungeon Lords to new players, it's actually best to explain how the combat works, because that way they know what they're working towards instead of just being floundering in the beginning trying to gather all these resources and not understanding exactly how those resources are needed or how they're even going to help them in the 2nd half of every game year. There's 4 different kinds of adventurers that comes with Dungeon Lords. You have your basic adventurer, the fighter. You have your thief. You have your priest or your healer, whatever you want to call them. And finally, you have your wizards that can be part of the adventurer party that's attacking your dungeon. Now, the rules state, and the way the game is designed, is you're never going to have more than 3 adventurers attacking your dungeon. And if you ever forget, there's only 3 spaces for adventurers, and if you're following the rules of the game, it's actually impossible to ever get a 4th adventurer. I just wanted to bring them up to show you that there are indeed 4 different kinds of adventurers. Plus, there's the nasty old paladin who can make your life very, very difficult if your evil meter ever gets to the point where you attract the paladin's attention. And if you ever forget, there's a symbol right here on the evil track that shows the paladin. If you ever reach that level or higher, you immediately attract the paladin. He's going to stay in your dungeon until he's either defeated, you go through 4 combat rounds, and he decides to wander away because the year is over, or if another player just happens to get more evil than you are. If another player ever gets more evil than you are, the paladin's actually going to leave the current dungeon he's in, and he's going to meander over to the dungeon of the player who's more evil than you. It's kind of a nice strategy, a nice tactic to play in the game, and when you actually get better at the game, it's a fun strategy to attract the paladin to your dungeon, then play very wisely to drop your evil meter down and watch the paladin go off to another player who wasn't expecting him, and watch the paladin start trashing that player's perfectly laid out dungeon. Now, each single adventurer is going to bring something unique to the party that's going to make your life a little bit more difficult. The warrior is always going to take the lead in all adventurers unless the paladin happens to be out, because the paladin is a bigger warrior than the warrior, and he says, I go first because I'm the paladin. The thief is going to allow your traps to cause less damage. The priest is going to heal damage, and the wizard is going to allow these battle cards to cause effects on you and make your life just a little bit more miserable. Now, these symbols on the bottom of all these adventurer cards are cumulative, and that does mean that if you happen to have 2 trap symbols plus a paladin for another 2 trap symbols, that means your traps are going to do 4 less points of damage. If you have 2 heart symbols plus 2 more heart symbols, that does mean that at the end of the combat round, when the healing phase happens, they're going to heal a total of 4 points of damage. And if you happen to have 2 spell gems plus 2 more spell gems, that means you have a total of 4 points of spell power on this adventuring party, which means all 4 spell cards will affect you this game year. You do have ways to protect yourself, though. You do have monsters such as trolls who like to fight, but they need to be paid food to become even stronger, and they also cost food for upkeep. You have monsters such as the vampire, who like to fight and can actually attack, but they can't attack priests, but they can actually attack adventurers further back in the line. But having them makes you much more evil, so you gotta be very, very careful about having vampires as part of your dungeon. And then finally, you also have monsters such as ghosts, who, while they may increase your evil level, they also allow you to break the rules and the restrictions about fighting in dungeon corridors and fighting in dungeon rooms. Every single combat phase is going to be broken down into 4 combat rounds, and each one of these combat rounds is going to be broken down into some smaller phases that are going to be carried out in an exact, very exact way. And I emphasize that you have to carry these combat rounds out in a very precise, exact way, because it's part of your strategy. And if you play it out of turn, you're actually going to mess yourself up, so you have to be very careful. Luckily, there are some very nice reminders on the top of every single dungeon board that tells you exactly how every single combat phase will carry out every single round. The first thing that's going to happen at the very start of the very first combat round of the combat is that you're going to decide exactly which dungeon tile in your dungeon is going to be attacked by this group of adventurers. Now, you get very limited decision power here because these dungeon adventurers are very, very lazy, and they're going to go to the closest, easiest route to access. You notice in every single dungeon board, there's a pair of stairs that leads into the very first dungeon room. That's where they're going to go because they're lazy adventurers and they take the shortest path of resistance. If they go through this dungeon room and they happen to defeat it, then and only then you have a choice, because again, they're going to go after the dungeon tile that's closest to the entrance or exit for the dungeon. So this dungeon tile has been conquered. They'll either go here or here, and it's completely your choice. But if you happen to have your dungeon built like this, they're going to go from here to here, and if they conquer that, they're going to go here. And then once they've conquered that one, you have a choice at this point to let them go here or here. But otherwise, they're going to follow a very specific and a very straight path, the path of least resistance from the entrance to your dungeon. The first thing you need to do before you start the combat is you need to figure out exactly which room of your dungeon these adventurers are going to attack. And again, you follow the simple rules. They go towards the path of least resistance, and that's where the very first combat round is going to happen. Once you've decided where the very first combat round is going to happen, you get to decide what kind of monsters and what kind of traps you get to play to help protect this room from these marauding adventurers. Now, corridors and dungeon rooms have slightly different rules. In a corridor, you can only protect a corridor with 1 monster only, and you can protect it with 1 trap. Dungeon rooms are a little bit different. You can protect a dungeon room with up to 2 monsters, and if you ever forget, there's a little symbol here for 1 or 2. There's room for 1 or room for 2 monsters, and you can protect a dungeon room with up to 2 monsters and up to 1 trap. The trick here, though, is that if you are protecting a dungeon room, it's going to cost you 1 gold to power that trap beyond any cost that that trap may tell you that you have to pay. Now, most of these traps don't have a cost, but some of them do have a cost, and if they do have a cost, you have to pay that 1 gold on top of that cost for that trap, and if you can't afford it, you can't play that trap in the first place because that would be an illegal move. You have to be able to pay for the trap to play it. Now, also note these are also limits for these corridors and also for these rooms. You can play 1 monster if you want to protect a dungeon room, or you can play no monsters if you want to protect that dungeon room, and there's various reasons why you may want to do that, and there are some good strategies for doing that. You also can play 1 trap, or you can play no traps, especially if you can't afford to pay for the trap in the first place. So once you've decided what room in the dungeon this combat round is going to take place with, if you are allowed a decision, and if you're not allowed a decision, you have to take your combat round, whatever the rules force you to do. You're going to decide if you want to play one or more monsters to protect that dungeon room. And then you're going to decide if you're going to play one trap. And again, if you're in a room, you have to pay for that trap. If you're in a corridor, you don't have to pay any extra cost for that trap. There's one slight way to break this rule, though. Ghosts don't happen to count as monsters when it comes to the max amount of limits you can have for protecting a corridor or for protecting a room. If you happen to have any ghosts in your dungeon, they can be added on top of the monsters that are there to protect that dungeon. As a matter of fact, there's no limit to the amount of ghosts you can have on top of these monsters protecting your dungeon from these adventurers. So if you happen to be in this room, you could have 2 monsters protecting that room, plus you can have a ghost, and if you happen to have any more ghosts, you can have those ghosts also protecting that room. Or if you happen to be in a tunnel entrance, you could have 1 monster protecting, plus as many ghosts as you want protecting that room, because ghosts break the rule in that aspect. Now, before you ask, why don't I just fill my dungeon with a whole bunch of ghosts? Well, there's a couple of very good reasons for not doing that. First of all, ghosts are very, very limited. Ghosts will never, ever attack the first adventurer in line when it comes to the adventuring party. So this is the adventuring party attacking our dungeon. The ghost will never attack the paladin, but he can attack any one of these adventurers. Also, on top of that, ghosts are not worth any victory points at the end of the game, because ghosts, while they like to claim they are monsters, unfortunately the rest of the monsters have voted them out of the Monster League. And they're not technically monsters, but they like to let them pretend just to make them feel a little bit better about themselves. After you decided exactly which room the combat phase is going to happen in, you decide which trap you want to play, you decide which monsters you want to protect this dungeon room, you can go ahead and move on to the next part of the combat phase, which is revealing the combat spell that's going to activate this round. Now the spell doesn't go off yet, so be very careful. Don't panic yet. The spell doesn't go off yet, but it's going to be going off very, very soon. And again, if you ever forget, your dungeon board does list exactly in what order all these effects are going to happen in. Once you've seen exactly which spell is going to go off, you move on to the resolution phase, and we're going to go ahead and take care of this combat round by resolving from left all the way to right, starting with a trap as the very first thing that's going to happen. But before we get there, I need to show you there's 2 different kinds of spells. There are fast spells that will happen on the fast spell phase, and there are also slow spells that will happen on the slow spell phase. And there's never a spell that can be a fast and a slow spell. It's either going to be a fast spell or a slow spell, and you can tell the difference because of the lightning bolt or the moss. Lightning bolt for speed, moss for a rolling stone that gets stuck, and whatever metaphor you choose to use. Now that we figured out what spell is exactly going to go off, it's now time to resolve this combat round, and we're going to see exactly what's going to happen to our dungeon and see if we manage to defeat these adventurers before they cause havoc on our wonderful dungeon we worked so hard to design. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to start from left to right, and you're going to resolve all the effects. The first thing that's going to happen is you're going to reveal your trap, and you're going to have that trap go into effect, and it's going to affect the adventuring party. You simply just follow the text and do exactly what it does, unless the adventuring party happens to have some thieves, which are going to make it very hard for your traps to do any damage at all. For example, the pendulum says the second adventurer token takes 3 damage, 4 damage if you're playing the second year. We're going to pretend we're playing the first year here just for this example. So my first adventurer is the paladin, my second adventurer is the warrior. So naturally the warrior would take 3 points of damage, except for the fact that I happen to have a thief, and I also happen to have a paladin make my life much more difficult. Before the trap damage resolves, I need to add up the total amount of these little symbols, and if you forget those symbols match the same symbol on the back of the trap cards, you're going to add up the total of all those symbols, and that's going to reduce the total damage done by this trap. So this trap normally would do 3 points of damage. We have 2 protection from the thief, plus 2 protection from the paladin, so this trap is going to do no damage at all, which makes it a complete waste. Now if we happen to be a little bit luckier, and let's say this paladin wasn't harassing us and making our life utterly difficult, and let's say our evil level isn't quite that bad, so the paladin hasn't come to make our lives challenging, if this trap happened to go off, it's going to do 3 points of damage to whoever the second adventurer is in line, minus the total that any thieves may prevent. So this is a 3 damage trap. I have 2 protection from a thief, so there's going to be 1 point of damage to whoever happens to be the second adventurer in the line. Once the trap is resolved, it's discarded and removed from the board unless it has a lingering effect, and you just want to leave it around until that lingering effect expires. The next thing that's going to happen is the spell is going to go off if it is a quick spell. And again, if you forget, there's a symbol for a quick here, symbol for a slow here. You're just going to figure out if you have a quick spell. If you have a quick spell, it's going to activate. If you don't have a quick spell and you happen to have a slow casting spell, nothing is going to happen and you're going to move immediately to the monster attack phase. But since in this example we happen to have a quick spell, what's going to happen is the quick spell is going to go off and we're going to read its effect and do exactly what it says. This one says for each monster in combat, and that means that it's currently in the combat versus the adventurers, not monsters who are still back here in your lair. The ones you've actually sent into this combat, I have to pay their cost for that monster or they're going to withdraw and head back to my lair and not do anything at all. So now you can see exactly where some of the decision making is going to come in, especially if you've been paying attention to some of these monsters I happen to have out right here, and you happen to be looking exactly where I am on the evil meter. If I look at all my monsters I have here, if I want to keep this ghost in combat, it's going to cost me 1 point on the evil meter, and when I see that, because we got the little dark smiley face, which matches the symbol over here, so if I want to keep him, it's going to cost me 1 evil. If I want to keep my troll in this combat, I need to feed him 2 food, otherwise he's going to meander back to the lair. And if I want to keep the vampire in this fight, I need to pay 2 evil. But if I happen to pay that 2 evil, look where my evil track's going to go, and look who I'm going to attract to make my life very, very difficult. So this is where some of the decision process comes in. So I can elect not to pay my vampire because I don't want to deal with a paladin, and I don't want my evil meter to go up that high. So I'm stuck with just these 2 monsters left to protect my dungeon in this room, and then we're done with the spell phase. After the spell phase, it's now time for me to have my monsters attack the heroes, and since I have 2 monsters, I get to decide in exactly what order they're going to attack the heroes and exactly which one of their abilities I want to use. Some of the monsters have an ability that's above the line and one that's below the line, and you can't use both. You decide which one exactly you're going to use, and some monsters also have restrictions. Now, it takes me a while to go through every single one of these monsters and show you exactly what all their restrictions are, and pretty much slow down this video, which is probably going to be an hour and 20-minute video just because I know exactly how Dungeon Lords is, and I don't want that to happen. So basically there's a little section in the glossary for the rulebook that tells you exactly what all these symbols mean, but I'm just going to quickly go over them. The troll will do 3 points damage to whoever adventurer happens to be in the lead. If I pay him 1 food, he's going to do 4 points damage to whoever's in the lead. The ghost will never attack the adventurer who is in the lead, but he'll attack anybody behind the first adventurer for 2 points of damage. And now I get to decide exactly what I want to do. Now, the smart strategy would be to have the ghost attack first, do 2 points of damage to the thief, which would be a total of 3 points of damage, defeating the thief, who now goes inside my dungeon, and the priest now moves up, and now I have 1 less adventurer to use, and now the ghost is going to go back to the lair, face down, because I cannot use him anymore for this entire combat round. Now, some monsters are actually able to bypass this. If you see a monster that has this little silver return arrow, that means that after they do their damage, they're going to return to their lair face up, able to use in future combat rounds. But that means he does less damage. But I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Just want you to know that not all monsters are going to go face down, but the vast majority, after they do their effect or their damage, they're going to return to your lair face down, and you cannot use them anymore for this entire combat round. Now that we've resolved our first monster, we can resolve our second monster, which is going to be our troll. He only attacks a front party member, and I can either do 3 damage, or I can discard 1 food to do 4 points damage, which I think will be a good idea here. So we're going to go ahead and do 4 points of damage to the adventurer who happens to be in the lead. I don't have any more monsters left, so we're done with that part of the combat phase. We now move to the next part, which is if there was a slow spell to go off, it would now go off. Just to show you an example, if this happened to be the slow spell that we happen to have, we're going to see if it's going to go off. And it's going to be Detect Evil, and it says you gain 2 evil, which will put me up 2 marks on the evil track, which in this example would give me back the paladin. But since we don't happen to have a slow spell, we're dealing with a quick spell right now. We're not going to have a slow spell effect going off, so we're going to bypass the slow spell. And now we're going to come to the part where any healers in the party are going to heal, and then we're going to figure out exactly what's going to happen after that. Now, the way healing works is you're simply going to remove as many damage, starting with the front adventurer, as there are hearts left in your surviving adventurer party members. So if you have 1 priest who can heal for 2, you're going to remove 2 points of damage. If you have 2 priests left over with a total of 3 hearts, you can heal for a total of 3 points of damage. There is one caveat to this though, and this is extremely important, and it's also part of the strategy. Priests will only heal if you attacked with a monster this round. If you only happen to use traps, and I mean only use traps, you don't have any monsters attacking this round at all, then the priest will not heal. I want to emphasize this is very, very important. Priests will only heal if a monster attacked on this combat round. So sometimes there's a very good strategy and very good reason not to attack with any of your monsters and only use traps until the priests are defeated. But in this example, since we did attack with monsters, and we only have 2 adventurers left, and we happen to have 3 points of damage that we need to be dealing with. I'm sorry, 4 if my memory doesn't fail me. Since we have 4 points of damage we need to deal with, and since 2 monsters did attack, we have 1 priest. He's going to heal 2 points of damage, and that's going to end the healing step, and we're now going to move on to the fatigue and the resolution phase for this combat round. The way fatigue works is you're going to look at the bottom right hand corner of every single one of these spell cards, and you're going to see a certain amount of blood drops, anywhere from 0 all the way up to 3 blood drops. And that's the amount of damage that's going to be spread to the adventuring party one by one. So this card right here happens to have 2 blood symbols on it, so the front adventurer is going to get 2 points of damage. Now the reason why I said it's one by one is, let's say for example this warrior already had 4 points of damage and he's 1 point away from dying, and we still have to take 2 fatigue. The first point of fatigue would be enough to defeat this warrior, and he would be defeated and sent to the dungeon, and there's still 1 more point of fatigue to deal with, and it's going to carry over onto the priest. And that's the very important distinction between damage from monsters and damage from fatigue. Damage from monsters never carries over, but damage from fatigue does carry over. So if this priest happens to have 3 points of damage on him, and I hit him with this troll for 3 points of damage, he's still going to be defeated, but any adventurers that happen to be behind him, the troll's damage is not going to carry over. But fatigue damage from these cards does carry over and does take out the adventurers one by one. After the fatigue has been dealt with, if any of the adventurers are left alive, even if it's just 1 adventurer left alive, that's still enough of adventuring force to conquer the current tile. They're going to conquer that tile. That's going to be the end of this combat round, and then we're going to move on to the next combat round. Starting with the planning phase, we're going to reveal the card, and then we're going to go ahead and handle the cards, the traps, the spells, and the monsters. And we're going to keep doing this 4 times until we manage to either defeat all the adventurers, or they happen to wipe out my dungeon and start freeing some of the prisoners. Now there's one thing I did gloss over, but that's because I didn't want to confuse basic combat, and that's exactly how these spells go off and how they affect everything that goes on the game board. You notice that above every one of these spell cards there's a symbol of a gem. 1 gem, 2 gems, 3 gems, and 4 gems. And those gems also happen to match the exact same symbols that are on the bottom of every single spellcaster, and also the gem symbols are on the bottom of the paladin. What that means is that this spell is only going to go off if there's enough spell gems left in the party to go ahead and cast that spell. So if this happened to be the adventuring party we had to deal with in this combat, just for example, we're going to see we have a warrior, we happen to have a priest, and we happen to have a wizard with 2 spell gems worth of power. That means that when the first combat round comes across, the first spell only costs 1 spell gem to activate, so this spell is going to go off and affect this player. Since we have 2 spell gems, we know that this card is also going to go off and it's going to affect this player. When we get to the 3rd combat round, since we only have 2 spell gems worth of spells, this 3rd spell is not going to go off because it takes 3 total spell power to go off. So unless we happen to have the paladin out there that we happen to be dealing with, or unless we had a 2nd spellcaster, we're not going to have to worry about the 3rd or the 4th spell at all. But if we happen to have very bad luck and we happen to be fighting a wizard of strength 2 plus the paladin, we're going to see 2 gems plus 2 gems is a total of 4 gems, meaning that if we don't start defeating these guys, they're going to have enough spell power to make sure all 4 of these spells go off and affect our adventuring board. Now I got to emphasize one thing though, that these spells are, I don't want to use unique because that's the wrong word, but they're going to be judged for every single player. So if you happen to be a lucky player who happens to have an adventuring party that doesn't happen to have a wizard attacking you, then you never have to worry about these spell cards ever going off because there's no spell points to activate them. Of course, unless somehow the paladin comes to make your life difficult, then you gotta start worrying. Luckily for you though, every time one of your dungeon rooms happens to be conquered by an adventuring party, your evil meter does go down one level, making sure that you're less of a target for the paladin. That's the good news. The bad news though is that the paladin's already come to visit you. He's not going to leave you just because your evil meter's dropped from "I'm such a terrible person" down to "I'm really not such a bad guy if you just learn how to understand me." So once the paladin has been attracted to your board, he is going to stay with you until something happens. Either one player passes the level and attracts the paladin over to their dungeon board, or you happen to defeat the paladin, or the full 4 combat rounds go off and all these adventurers leave your dungeon and head off for greener pastures. Now that you've seen how combat works, the rest of the early phases for the first half of the game is going to make a lot more sense to you because you're going to understand what you're working towards so you can survive each year to win the game. The first thing you need to do though before you can actually start playing is you need to take all your order cards, and every single player has a hand of exactly 8 order cards. They're exactly the same except for they're color coded. The red player has the red cards, the green player has the green cards, blue player blue cards, etc. You're going to shuffle these up and you're going to take 2 of these cards at random, and there's going to be order cards that are not going to be accessible to you for the very first order phase. Now this again adds another randomizer to the game. And again, this is using the standard rules for the game. With the advanced rules, this is done a little bit differently to make it a little bit less random and add more strategy to the game. But with the basic rules, since players are still learning the game, they suggest this is how you do it because it's going to reduce the paralysis as people are trying to make decisions over things they don't quite understand yet. These order cards are going to correspond with the order spaces on the main central board for the game. Every player, again, like I said, has the exact same set of order cards, and they're going to match these actions that you can take. Basically, when the order phase comes around, you're going to pick 3 order cards and you're going to carry out those orders. And basically, there's an order card that allows you to get more food, order card that allows you to increase your evil or decrease your evil meter so you do a little bit better public relations so that people don't think you're quite as evil, so the paladin kind of doesn't keep his eye on you quite as much. There's an order card that's going to allow you to add tunnels to your dungeon and build your dungeon and make it bigger. There's an order card that's going to allow you to put your imps out to work to start making gold so you can have more gold to pay your taxes when the time comes around. There's an order card that's going to allow you to hire more imps because the more imps you can have, the more imps you can send out there to build more tunnels, and the more imps you can have for mining gold, again to start paying your taxes when that happens. There's an order card that's going to allow you to buy traps. There's an order card that's going to allow you to hire monsters. And finally, there's an order card which is going to allow you to buy rooms that you can add to your dungeon. Now the trick with rooms is they have to replace a tunnel currently on the board. Rooms aren't going to be added onto your dungeon. They are literally going to replace dungeon tiles you currently have on the board. And not only that, all the rooms in the first year, not the second year, but the first year can only be built on certain levels in certain areas of your dungeon. What you're going to do is you look at the room tile, and it's going to show some lit squares and some dark squares. This tile can only be built on squares that are lit up. So for example, this tile or this room can only be built in the top 2 rows of your dungeon. This room right here can only be built in the bottom 2 levels of your dungeon. This room tile right here can only be built on the outskirts of your dungeon. And another one, for example, would be this one, which can only be built on the inner sections of your dungeon. And again, you're going to take this room and it's going to replace any one of your tunnels as long as it's built in a legal position. This tile is to be re-added to the pile for other players to purchase, and that tile is now part of your dungeon for the rest of the game. Now there are rules that dictate exactly how you can build your dungeon, how you can lay out rooms, and exactly how they can be connected to each other, and you have to make sure you follow these rules specifically every time you play the game. And if you violate the rules, you can't place that tile because you can only place dungeon tiles, meaning the corridors, and dungeon tiles meaning the rooms in specific ways when you're playing the game. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I'll show you exactly how that works when we get to that point. I just want to remind you that there is a specific exact way to do that. But again, I'll get to that when we get to that point. First, I want to show you exactly how the game book moves starting with the seasons board. The season board is going to break down exactly how you're going to be handling every single phase for each one of the seasons. And there's a very nice handy reminder on the seasons board in case you ever forget exactly what you're supposed to be doing on every single phase. And these symbols are extremely intuitive once you know exactly how to play the game. And I'll say this is so intuitive to the point that I haven't actually read the rulebook for Dungeon Lords in probably maybe a year, if not longer. And I haven't played this game since April, and I decided to go ahead and shoot this video without even having to double check my work. And I'm so confident in how well these symbols were designed that I'm pretty sure that I'm going to explain this game pretty perfectly just because of how well the visual aids for this game were when they made this game. As I said earlier, Dungeon Lords is definitely a game of controlled chaos, but it's also a game of future planning. This is one of those games where you may be in the winter phase, but you're planning for the spring. You may be in the spring, but you're planning for the summer. And during the summertime, you're planning for the fall. And all the while, through all 4 of these seasons, you're planning for how these adventurers are going to come ransack your dungeon that you're carefully building so you can make sure that your dungeon survives, so you can score the most points and win at the end of the game. The very first phase of every single season is basically going to be the reveal phase, where you're going to reveal what's going to be happening on the future seasons for the current calendar year. And if you ever forget, there's a nice reminder. It says during the first phase of winter, what you're going to do is you're going to reveal the first 2 rooms that are going to be available to be purchased by the players during the orders phase. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to reveal the top 3 monsters that are going to be available for purchase during the orders phase, and these are going to be available for the players as long as they take the proper action. They can buy these 3 monsters. And next thing it's going to tell you is it's going to reveal the very first event that you're going to encounter. Now all 3 of these event tiles are going to be randomized every single year. One of these event tiles is going to tell you to pay taxes. One of these event tiles is going to tell you that you need to feed all your monsters you currently have in your dungeon. And then one of these is going to be a blank that's going to be used with those special event cards. If you're not using the special event cards, it's basically a reprieve. Nothing's going to happen. If you are using the special event cards, one of those events is going to happen, and it's going to change how things are going to happen for that year. After you reveal the future event, you're going to figure out exactly which adventurers are going to start appearing in the springtime. Now remember, we're still in the winter time, and like I said, this is a game of future planning, so what we're doing is we're figuring out what's going to be happening in the next season, and again, that's all part of the future planning. Now I'm showing you how to play the game with the 4-player rules. With the 3-player rules and the 2-player rules, there's a slight variation to this. One of the most important things is that there's only going to be 3 adventurers. I don't want to confuse things too much. There's a 1 page in the rulebook that tells you what changes are going to happen with the 3 or the 2 players. It's very small, very easy to read, and I'm not going to stretch out this video for something that's pretty easy to figure out. You're going to draw the 4 adventurers, and you're going to play them out in the order they're drawn, but after you play them out, they're going to adjust their order based on exactly how strong they are in relation to each other. Now, every one of these adventurers you're going to see is a different shade from each other, and they're also going to have a symbol in the upper left-hand corner that's either more or less complex. The more complex the symbol, the more relatively powerful that adventurer is, and the further he's going to go up in the track. You're going to keep these adventurers in relatively the same order if they happen to be the same strength, but you're going to make sure the lightest colored, and that also happens to be the one with the most complex symbol, is furthest to the right, and the one with the darkest color and the least complex symbol is furthest to the left. That's the very important thing. So we're going to see that we have a symbol with 1 dot and a symbol with 1 dot, and these are the darkest adventurers, so they're the weakest relatively. We have a little bit more complex symbol and a little bit lighter shade background, and then we have an even lighter shade and a most complex symbol, who's going to be the furthest one on the right. That's all we're going to do for this phase, and if we ever forget, there's a symbol here. It says 2 rooms, 2 monsters, event, and reveal the top 4 adventurers. Next thing we're going to do is we'll move on to the round where we start sending out our orders and figuring out exactly what we're going to do, and this is the phase that has the most interaction. During the orders phase, each player is going to secretly take their order cards. Now they should have 6 order cards left because they have 2 order cards up here that are not accessible and they cannot use. They're simply going to go through their 6 order cards, and they're going to lay their order cards down in the order that they hope for these to happen based on what they see on this board of the adventurers that are becoming, based on the the monsters are currently available to be hired, based on the rooms are currently available to be purchased, and also based on exactly what they need to do to improve their dungeon, their stockpiles, and exactly their standings in the game. After players pick their 3 cards, they're going to secretly place them down in the order that they want them to be played. They're not going to show them to any other players, and their 3 remaining cards are going to be set off to the side. And once every single player has done that, we're going to move to the reveal part of the orders phase. And then we're going to place our minions out. And then we're going to figure out exactly which orders are going to be carried out and exactly which order by which players. If you look over at the main board, you're going to notice that there's a number of Roman numerals from 1 to 3 for each one of the orders that you can do. 1 to 3 for the food, 1 to 3 for the lowering yourself on the villainous track, 1 to 3 for building more tunnels in your dungeon, and that goes all the way across for all 8 of these orders. And these are going to be resolved in order from left to right, top to bottom. So we're going to go through all 8 of these orders based on what orders we're going to be taking actions with based on the order cards we decided to play for this round. Once all the players have their order cards, they're going to flip up their very first order card and they're going to reveal it to all the players, and then players are going to place their minions on the orders in order of player order. And that's a whole bunch of use of the word order, but it'll make sense in just a second. Starting with the starting player and going in clockwise order, and the starting player is the one who has the starting player token. They're going to take one of their minions and they're going to place it on the order board based on what order they decide to pick for this turn. So the red player, for their order, they decide that they're going to reduce their level on the evil meter, and they're also going to look at the very first card that happens to be on the spell deck, so they're less surprised when the combat round comes around. So they're going to take their minion, place him on the number 1, and now we're going to move on clockwise order to the blue player who decided that they wanted to buy one of the rooms. So they're going to put their minion on the number 1 space of the buy room. Green player decided that they wanted to buy a trap, so they're going to place their minion on the buy trap space, again in the number 1 spot. Yellow decides that they also want to work on improving their reputation with the townsfolk. Then we're going to reveal the second card. And then we're going to place our minions out in the exact same order, which I'll do very quickly off camera. And then finally we're going to come to the third order where everybody's going to reveal their final third order. And then again, they're going to place their minions out on the board based on player order. So starting with the red player, they decided that they wanted to buy a minion. So they're going to take the number 1 spot. The blue player decided that they're going to go after buying a trap. The green player decided that they're going to hire an imp. And the yellow player decided that they want to try to get some food to fill out their stockpiles, so they have a little bit more resources for whatever their future plans happen to be. Once all the players have their minions on the main central board, we're just simply going to resolve these again from left to right, top to bottom, and we're always going to resolve it in the order of the bars, judging by the size. The shortest bar will happen before the longest bar, and that's very important because you'll see the first 6 orders, the shortest bar is on top, while the last 2 orders, the shortest bar is on the bottom, and that becomes very important if you have multiple players going after some of these other orders on later rounds or even on the current round, however it may be. So you're simply going to resolve these in order. Red's going to have to pay 1 gold, and if they pay 1 gold, they're going to gain 2 food. If they decide that they don't want to do that, they're simply going to pick up their minion, place it on top of that action to let them know that they didn't perform this action this turn. If they do decide to pay that action, they're simply going to pay the 1 gold to gain the 2 food. Green's going to do the same thing, except their cost is going to be different. They're going to pay 1 level on the evil meter to gain 3 food, and then yellow has to pay 2 food on the evil meter to gain 3 food and 1 gold. Then we're going to move over to red again. They're going to go 1 down on the evil meter. They're going to get to look at the top card, figure out what it is, so at least they have some advance warning about the stuff that's going to be coming. And now I say you look at the top card, but you can actually pick any one of these cards and look at them and place them back, but you never ever change the order of these cards. You simply just look at it so you get an advanced glimpse of what's going to be coming during the future combat rounds. Yellow would get 2 down on the evil meter. We move over to blue, who's going to go ahead and work on building some tunnels in his dungeon using the red player's board, because I don't have a blue board out. If this was the blue player's board, they'd simply use imps to build on their dungeon. Now there's certain rules that you have to follow when you're building your dungeon. I'm going to go ahead and cover that right now. When you're building your dungeon, you can never completely cover a 2x2 square, filling up all 4 of the squares. Now what that means exactly is that, well, everything I built out here is totally legal. I could not build a tunnel right here because this creates a complete 2x2 square, which is an illegal move. But I could build a dungeon tile here, and then build another dungeon tile here, and that's perfectly legal. But I couldn't build a dungeon tile here because that creates a 4x4 or 2x2. I couldn't do it here because that creates a 2x2. But I could build like this and like this because that's completely legal moves. The important thing to remember is that you can never have a 2x2 filled in completely, either with corridors or even by that, even rooms, because remember, rooms replace corridors, and that being a legal placement of a room, not allowed. You got to make sure that you never fill a 2x2 completely up. And again, you're simply going to go down, and if there's multiple people going after the same resource, they're going to basically pay or receive whatever happens to be there. The first player can have up to 2 imps building up to 2 tunnels. The second player can have up to 3 imps building 3 tunnels, as long as they have the 3 imps available. If you have less imps than that, you can pay as many imps as you want. Or even if you have this space, you don't have to build all 3. You can just use 1 imp to build 1 tunnel. It just allows you to build up to 3 imps to build up to 3 tunnels. And then the final space is going to allow you to have up to 4 imps building tunnels. But one of your imps, the 5th imp, has to be the supervisor. And that supervisor has to be there even if you only want to build 1 tunnel. So you're basically going to have 1 imp become the supervisor at the top of the tunnel. And then the next imp you're going to pick to go ahead and pick a spot where they're going to go ahead and build a tunnel and add to your dungeon. The next action space is the gather the gold space, and it's basically just like the building the tunnels with the imps. Your first guy can send up to 2 imps out onto tunnels and onto tunnels only, and these have to be imps that you already possess in your workforce. You're simply going to put them on top of a tunnel, and it doesn't matter if the tunnel was just built this round. You'll place them on top of the tunnel, and they're going to dig, and they're going to add 1 gold to your resources. So the first player can do up to 2 imps, second player can do up to 3 imps, the fourth player can be doing up to 4 imps, but he needs to pick an imp to be a supervisor, and it can't be the same imp who's supervising the tunnel building. So if you happen to be in space number 3 here, and you happen to use space number 3 also here, that means you need a supervisor for the gold mining, and you're going to need a supervisor for the tunnel building, so you better make sure you have a lot of imps to go out there and do all the work you need them to do. The next action space is the purchase imp space, and basically it's 1 food for 1 imp if you happen to be on this spot. 2 food gives you 2 imps if you happen to be on that spot, and finally 1 gold and 1 food will also give you 2 imps. Now you can't here, for example, pay 1 food for 1 imp. It's 2 food for 2 imps or nothing. And again, remember, if you don't take the action, you simply remove your minion from the space and place them back on the card, letting them know that you did not actually take that action this round. And that's very important. I'll show you exactly why during the cleanup phase. So just to go back so we can remember this later, let's pretend Red did not use the food buying action because he wanted to keep his gold because he was afraid of future taxes slowing him down. The next action or order phase space is you can spend 1 gold to buy 1 trap. Second player is very lucky. They happen to get a trap for free. And if there happens to be a third player there, they can basically spend 2 gold to get 2 traps. Now you can't spend 1 gold for 1 trap. It's 2 gold for 2 traps or 0 gold for 0 traps. It's one or the other. Then the next action space series we're going to see is the buy monster space. And now again, remember, shortest to longest is going to happen first. So while this person down here gets first pick among the 3 monsters, they also have to pay 1 food out of their resources, and they get to pick any one of these monsters, add it to the workforce if they're willing to pay the cost. And they have to be able to pay the cost. If they can't afford the cost of the monster, they can't hire it. So the troll costs 2 food, goblin costs 1 food, the witch happens to cost 1 food, and I also have to go up 1 level on the evil meter. Next player is going to be able to buy without the extra food cost. So blue, if he happened to have 2 minions out buying there, I can simply buy another minion or another monster, pay his cost, and then green gets to do the same thing. They get to pick the remaining minion as long as they can pay his cost, and they're going to add him to his adventuring board. After we're done there, we're going to simply move to the third one, which is the buying a room tile. Now this is the one that's the most contested because you'll see there's 3 spaces available, but there's only 2 rooms to buy. And again, since we resolved from shortest to longest bar, that means red is going to be able to pick one of these rooms, pay a gold, and it's now their room they get to add to their dungeon. Yellow gets to pay a gold if they can afford to buy this dungeon room, and that means blue doesn't get to do anything because unfortunately there's no rooms left for them to buy. Now rooms, just like tunnels, have certain restrictions when you add them to the board. Like I said earlier, when you add a room to the board, you have to place it in a legal position. So this room is required to be in one of the outer limits or outer squares. And you see that because those are squares that are lit. This one is required to be in the bottom half of your dungeon board. So when you place it, you have to place it legally. And again, you're simply going to replace one of your tunnels, add it back into the pile for future purchases, and now this room is permanently part of your dungeon until it's conquered by one of the adventurers. Rooms do have two restrictions. One, they share from corridors. You can never have a symbol that or a formation that'd be a 2x2 formation of rooms. Rooms can never be added to the board like that. And it'd be illegal to do that anyways because rooms have to replace tunnels. So that should be pretty much a given at this point. But also know that rooms cannot be directly next to each other in an orthogonal pattern. They can be diagonally across from each other, but they can't be next to each other orthogonally. You can never add a room to the board if it would be next to another room. You could do a room, tunnel, room though, and that would be perfectly legal. This, however, would not be legal because this would fill in a 2x2. This would be okay. After all the orders have been resolved for all the players are going to take back their minions unless their minion happens to be on one of these cards because they didn't carry out their action. If they're left on a card because they did not carry out their action, they're going to stay on that card just for a little bit longer until we move into the next phase. Now that we're done with the order phase, we're going to move into what I like to call the stocking and the cleanup phase. For this phase, what's going to happen is if you happen to have any imps that have not been put to work either digging for gold or they haven't been put to work building tunnels into your dungeon, what you can do now is if you have any rooms, you can send imps into that room to get the rewards from those rooms. And it's going to tell you how many imps you need to add for whatever kind of reward it happens to be. So for example, if I have enough imps left over, I can send 3 imps over here and they'll earn me 1 gold. Or I can send 4 imps over here and they're going to allow me to get 1 more trap to add to my dungeon. Now be careful if, for example, in an earlier turn I had used this imp to build this tunnel and then immediately on the same turn I decide to build this room. This imp, he's stuck in this room because he's not sent back into the workforce because he's basically spending this whole phase continuing to work in that room. So I still have to add 4 imps on top of whatever imp I happen to have in there. He doesn't count towards the 4 imps to grab or gain that trap card. After you send all the imps to work in the rooms that you wanted to, you don't have to do it, but it's usually a good idea to do because there's not much for imps left to do at this point. So if you have the imps, send them to the rooms to send them to work. What you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and you're going to start trying to get some of your order cards back. Now the 2 order cards that were on top that you couldn't use this season are going to be added back into your hand. And then if you don't have any minions on any of these cards, the 2 cards that are over here, and if you forget which ones they are, the ones with the arrows, are going to move up here and you're not going to have access to them in the next season. But if in this example we happen to have a minion on one of these cards, we can choose to keep that 1 card back instead of sending that card up to the unavailable action phase. It's a choice we want. So if we have our minions over here, these 2 cards will slide up. This card would go back into our hand and we can choose that order on the next season. Or if, for example, that we have here, we happen to have a minion who happens to be on the food, I can decide that this is the card I want to keep to use again. And these 2 cards would be the ones that are going to slide up to be my orders are unavailable on the next season. The next phase will come around, which is going to be moving the current first player token goes to the next player in line. They're going to be the next first player for the next season. Then all of our imps that we sent out to work, they're going to return to their little homes inside our dungeon and they're ready to work during the next season. And we're done with this season, and then we move on to the next season where we're basically going to repeat exactly what we just did. We're going to add rooms, we're going to add monsters, we're going to reveal the next tile, and then we're going to add the next group of adventurers onto the board in the order in which they're drawn, adjusted by their power level. Again, we're going to put the most powerful one up front, giving us foreshadowing of exactly what's going to be happening. We're going to go out there and we're going to do the order part again where we're all going to play our order cards. Reveal our order cards, place the order board, then we're going to work in the rooms, pull our order cards back after we figured out what the heck we're going to be doing with our order cards, which ones we want to keep if we have a choice, otherwise they're going to simply flip over. And then we're going to move on to the random event phase. For example, for the taxation one, we have to pay 1 gold for every 2 rooms or corridors we happen to have in our dungeon, rounded up. So if we happen to have 5 tiles on our board, it's going to cost us 3 gold. If we happen to have 6, it's going to cost us 3 gold. If we happen to have 7, it's going to cost us 4 gold. And then finally, we're going to move to the next phase where the adventurers are going to start heading off to every one of our players' boards, getting ready to attack our dungeon at the end of the year. And we're simply going to do this by season, so these 4 guys aren't going to come towards our board yet, but since we're still in the springtime adventurers are going to start heading toward our adventurer boards. And the way this is going to work is the furthest left adventurer is going to go to the dungeon lord who happens to be the nicest on the evil meter. So for an example, in this example, this wizard would happen to go to the yellow adventurer's board. This warrior would go to the red adventurer's board, and now we have a tie between green and blue. This is where the first player token comes in effect, and if you ever forget, it's a nice smiley face to remind you that whoever the first player is, they happen to be the nicest player when it comes to breaking any and all ties, and whoever happens to be sitting closest to the first player is always nicer than the person sitting furthest away when it comes to breaking ties. Now, since we know that the blue player is the new current first player, we know that they're nicer than the green person. So that means that the blue player will get the next adventurer to go to his dungeon. And then finally, this adventurer is going to go to the green player's dungeon. Once you figured out which adventurers are going to go to which dungeons, they're going to be placed on the dungeon board of that player. And we're going to continue to go through all the phases, adding more adventurers to the board. And as we come to the silver space again, those adventurers are going to go towards the adventurers, or towards the dungeons, based again on who happens to be the evilest and who happens to be the nicest. Again, yellow would get this guy. This guy would go to red, who, since his special ability is warriors go in front, would push his way up front. Green would get the next guy. Blue would get the next guy. And then finally, in the third year, blue being the nicest would get this guy. Red being the next nicest would get this guy. This guy would go to yellow. And then finally this guy would go to the green adventurer. That's basically a long-winded version of Dungeon Lords in a nutshell. You're going to basically go through all these phases, completing all the actions as required by all these phases. You're going to do order phases, get more adventurers. Those adventurers are going to start working towards our dungeon keeper boards. We're going to start building up our dungeon keeper boards. Get monsters to protect our dungeon. Get traps to protect our dungeon so we can stop these adventurers from terrorizing our dungeon. Move on to the combat phase. Do all 4 phases of the combat phase. Then we're going to move into the second year where we're basically going to copy the exact same thing with a couple small minor changes. The very small changes that come about in the second year is the fact that you notice that the rooms in the second year don't have requirements about where they can be built or restrictions. They can be built anywhere in your dungeon as long as they replace a current corridor tile. They don't have the little lights that tell you where they have to be built or the little light colored squares telling you where they have to be built. You also notice that the monsters in the second year get more abilities and get a little bit more power, and they get a little more expensive to also put out on the board. There's actually only 2 real changes that come about in the second year when you're going through all 4 of the seasons. The first one is that anytime you are told to, or anytime you use a space to buy a trap, you're actually allowed to buy 1 more trap than what it says, and then you can look at your entire hand of all the traps you have and discard 1 of those trap cards. So if you happen to use this space, you're going to pick 3 trap cards, add them all to your hand, and then you're going to look through all the traps you have, and you're going to discard the one that you like the least to the board, and the rest of the traps you get to keep. And the other major change is that all these rooms that you can send imps to work in, you can actually use twice per phase instead of just once. So this room in the second year, I can send 4 imps to it for 1 trap, or I can send 8 imps to work there to gain 2 traps, and that only happens in the second year. Again, the second year, for everything else, is pretty much just the same. You're going to go through all the phases, going through the orders, building up your dungeon as much as you can. Just remember, rooms that are conquered stay conquered, and they're pretty much waste space. But unfortunately, even though they're a waste of space, you still have to pay taxes, even if the rooms have been destroyed by adventurers. That's the Ministry of Dungeons. They still want their money, no matter how much you argue that you've lost access to those rooms. Don't forget, though, you're also going to have the more powerful combat cards you're going to have to deal with during the combat. And you also have to deal with the more powerful Paladin, who is much nastier than the Paladin from the prior year. Now I know Dungeon Lords can seem a little bit overwhelming, especially when it's described to you on this format, but this is the best way to teach you how to play Dungeon Lords, to just basically show you how the game plays over the various phases. I'm going to go ahead and clean everything up and set everything up and show you exactly how Dungeon Lord plays in my second video. Once you see how Dungeon Lord plays, all this is going to make a lot more sense. You're going to see that Dungeon Lords is actually a very easy game to play. It's just very challenging to play well. This has been an off-the-shelf board games tutorial looking at Dungeon Lords by Vlada Hevadl. Stay tuned for part 2 where you get to watch some video gameplay. And then finally part 3 where I'll give you my full review on Dungeon Lords, the board game.